Hello and welcome back to Stop and Go F1 for this, our driver ratings for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. If you missed any of our coverage of the Las Vegas Grand Prix, it's all available on the channel right now, from the preview to qualifying to the race, of course. But now it's time for the driver ratings. We're going to give everyone a score between 1 and 10. And looking at my little sheet of paper here, we got a lot of 10s. We have got a few people who did very well this weekend. You know what? I think pretty much everyone delivered an okay performance. There's a couple there where I'm thinking not too good, but the majority of people I thought did actually quite well. We'll get into all of that and more in a little bit. Before we do though, like and subscribe, of course. A huge shout out to the members: Dakota, Joyous James, Robin Myers, and Cinnamon Strudel. Right then, let's do this. Starting with, of course, the Haas lads, Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hulkenberg. Now, Magnussen missed out last time out in Brazil. He had food poisoning, I believe, but he is back this weekend. And how did he do? Well, he qualified 12th and finished 12th. An okay one for Kevin Magnussen. I mean, it was about average, I think. I'm gonna give him a 6. I'd initially written down 7, but as is tradition on these videos, I write something down and I say something entirely different. So yeah, an okay result for Kevin Magnussen, 12 to 12. Although Nico Hulkenberg had a much better race. He qualified 9th and finished 8th. Picking up some more vital points for the Haas team. Haas now back in front of Alpine. After Alpine's incredible weekend in Brazil, they had leapfrogged Haas. But now, Haas back in front, very close going into the last two races. A lot of money on the line for those positions as well. So points like that from Hulkenberg, incredibly valuable. And for that reason, it's a 10 out of 10 for Nico Hulkenberg, finishing 8th in the Haas. And you know what? This man deserves some praise as well. Zhou Guan Yu. Wow. This might be his best ever race, you know. He qualified 13th. I think this is one of his first times out of Q1. Maybe he did it at the start of the year where the Sauber was a little bit better. But yeah, Sauber's been dreadful as of late. Qualifies 13th. For a little bit of the race, he was like 8th or 9th. Doing incredibly well, but eventually finished back in 13th place, which, for a Sauber is fantastic. And it's not like we had loads of DNFs, we had 2, and he still finished in 13th place. Great result for Zhou. I'm giving him a 10 out of 10. I know he didn't score any points, but that car can't score points, and I think he deserves to be praised for that. Meanwhile, Valtteri Bottas had the opposite performance. So Valtteri Bottas, he qualified 19th, had a 5-place grid penalty, and then because of Colapinto starting the pit lane, he started 19th, and in the end he finished 18th. And that was just because of the 2 people who DNF'd. So he was the last of the guys who actually finished in the race. So, yeah, not great for Bottas. I know normally if that was the position they finished in, I'd go, that's what you'd expect from the Sauber. But in a weekend when Zhou was doing so well, I wonder what went a bit differently for Valtteri Bottas from there. So I'm going to give him, I'm not going to be too harsh because it is a Sauber at the end of the day, but I think a 5 is a suitable score for that result. Let's keep on going now then with Yuki Tsunoda, who had a good weekend as well here. Yuki Tsunoda looks like he is being kind of tried as the potential replacement for Perez. He's done some very interesting interviews this weekend where he's like, look, I destroy my teammates all the time. They have to give me an opportunity at one point. To which I would say, I'm not too sure you have destroyed your teammates all the time. I mean, Gasly destroyed him for, I think it was 3 years in a row. Then, of course, there was Nick De Vries, who we beat pretty easily. Daniel Ricciardo, can't deny that, he did beat him there. And Liam Lawson, so far, I think, of the races they've shared together, including last year when Lawson filled in for Ricciardo, I think in the race, Yuki has beaten him 3 times. And I think they only had 9 races together as teammates. So I wouldn't say he's destroyed Lawson. In qualifying, yes, Yuki always outperforms Lawson in qualifying. But in the race itself, I would not say Yuki is destroying him. Although this weekend, he did kind of destroy him because Yuki Tsunoda did really well. Tsunoda qualified in 7th and finished the race in 9th. So got some good points for the team there. Outqualified the likes of Piastri and Lewis Hamilton. I mean, fantastic stuff from Yuki Tsunoda, who has really excelled in qualifying over the last couple of races. But yeah, really good stuff. Again, I'll give it a 10. Maybe it's the end of the year. I'm feeling a bit more generous, but I think that's a 10 out of 10 result. Liam Lawson, though, not a good result for him. This might be his. I know he only hasn't had many. Oh my god, words would be nice to say, wouldn't they? I know he hasn't had that many races, 9 if my stats are correct from before, but this might be his worst one because this was just very, very anonymous from Lawson. Whilst Yuki was qualifying 7th, he was down in 14th. Yuki finishes 9th. Lawson finishes 16th, and like I don't remember really seeing him in the race at any point doing anything. Very unlike him. So a quiet one for Liam Lawson this weekend, and I'm going to give him a 3 because I don't. I mean, realistically, I think maybe I'm being maybe a bit too generous there because I just don't really remember him doing anything. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but yeah, not a great one for Liam Lawson. Then we go to this man, Franco Colapinto. Now, wow, a mixed one for Colapinto. Now, qualified 14th, but had that huge crash, would start from the pit lane, and then fought back from the pit lane to finish 14th again. Now, I'm kind of in two minds about this one, because, there's part of me that's like, recovery from pit lane to 14th is pretty good. Also, there's been reported that he had like a massive concussion during the race, and realistically, he probably shouldn't have been racing, and still did very well to finish 14th. But then another part of me is like, well, he got that because he crashed, and that was his own fault. And, the Williams team are in a very difficult situation right now in terms of money and parts and all this kind of stuff. And the entire point Lawson was in the car to replace Sargent was firstly to score points, which he has done, but secondly, to crash less. And he's crashed 3 times in the last 2 races. So I'm kind of split here. It's hard. I'll give him a 6, I think. Yeah, I might change my mind on that later, but I think a 6 is pretty fair because it was all going well until it wasn't. Here is Alex Albon. So he was out-qualified by Colapinto. Albon out in Q1 in 17th, whereas Colapinto would go through. And then in the race itself, Albon had to retire pretty early on with some kind of engine issue. So we didn't really get to see much of him at all this weekend. But what we did see wasn't necessarily great. It's going to be a 4 from me for Alex Albon. Meanwhile, this man, Esteban Ocon, rather unlucky for Ocon, really. Qualifying went okay. Qualified in 11th place. Then in the race itself, for his first pit stop, he comes into the pits and his team just weren't ready. So he just drove through, went round again and had to pit again. So basically gave himself a drive-through penalty for the race. And then from there, how are you going to recover from that? An additional 20 seconds you've added onto your race because your team weren't ready. Then from that itself, he would end up finishing in 17th place. Not great, but also not necessarily his fault. And again, the Alpine seems a bit all over the place at the minute. I'm going to give him a 5 and move on from there. Now, speaking of heartbreak, here's Pierre Gasly. My goodness, what a qualifying that was. P3 in an Alpine in the dry. I have no idea how he did that. That was godly. Fantastic stuff from Pierre Gasly to manage to get that car third. I have no idea what was going on from there. Then the race itself started, and it's not like he dropped back dramatically. He was fighting with a few guys. Of course, he did go backwards because the Alpine shouldn't have been third, but he was still, doing pretty well, and then the engine blew up. So it's a really tough one to give him a score here. I don't know. I'm gonna go for a 7 for him. It could be an 8 for the qualifying alone, but I feel like I can't give him an 8 if he didn't even get to halfway through the race, even though it wasn't his fault. But 7 for Pierre Gasly there. Now Lance Stroll here also had a very difficult race. No radio for him from lap 1, so he was driving the race basically blind. In terms of pit stops and strategy and whatever it might be, had no radio, had some very long pit stops just because he was coming in when he thought he should, and sometimes the team wasn't ready for him. He qualified 18th, made up positions despite everything to finish in 15th place. Also, what you've got to remember about that qualifying was in FP3, his car broke down, nothing he could do about that. Then they had to fix it during qualifying. So he only got like one lap in qualifying on a track which was ever evolving and a track where you need to build your confidence with lap after lap after lap. And yes, he qualified last with his one lap. But, I thought that wasn't necessarily his fault either. And, we are harsh on Lance Stroll here, as everyone seems to be, but I think you've got to give him credit where it's due. He was under tremendous pressure in that qualifying session, and yeah, he still qualified last, but realistically, you're in an Aston, which is rubbish. You haven't had much time on the track, and especially in that session, that was on one lap. Then in the race, he has no idea what's going on and still makes up positions. So I think Lance Stroll had a decent one. I'm going to give him a 7 as well. Someone who needs celebrating more, though, is Fernando Alonso. Now, Alonso qualified in 16th place, but still managed to cut through to finish 10th in that Aston, which is dreadful. He scored a point. The Aston Martin has been abysmal for quite some time now, and I'm surprised they're as high up in the championship as they are. I think it's just because they were quite good at the start of the year. But yeah, now it's dreadful. I'm giving him a 10 out of 10 because he scored a point in it, and I don't know how he did it. Across to a team now which struggled a bit more, it's the McLarens. Oscar Piastri, not a great one for him. Qualified 8th, not fantastic, was beaten by Yuki Tsunoda there. Got a penalty for the starting procedure infringement. Apparently wasn't in the box in the right place. I from the replay I couldn't really tell, but there you go. And then from there, kind of just an anonymous one. The McLarens were kind of in a league of their own this weekend, where they weren't fast enough to catch the likes of your Ferraris, your Mercedes, or Max Verstappen, and they weren't slow enough to be in contention with your likes of your Haas, Racing Bulls, or whoever it might be there. So they're kind of just in the middle. But even in that little middle section, the gap between Oscar and Lando was so big that Lando had a free pit stop at the end of it with no worries about losing position to his teammates. So Piastri quite a bit off the pace of Lando Norris this weekend. But yeah, the McLaren was really nowhere. Speculation as to if that is about that rear wing that was banned or not. We'll have to speculate on that further, but there you go. I'm going to give Oscar a 6. I think a 6 is relatively fair. And then across to Lando Norris now. He qualified 6th, finished in 6th, got the fastest lap on the last lap. Like I said, wasn't really much the McLaren lads could do, although they did show a much better pace in the practice sessions than they did in actual qualifying. I thought they'd be a bit closer to the front. But yeah, Lando properly outshining his teammate this weekend, whilst not necessarily being able to gain anything on anyone else because the McLaren just wasn't there. I'm going to give him an 8 out of 10. Across to Ferrari now, and the best friends Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc. Something's gone on here. I don't fully understand what's happened, because Sainz wanted to pit. He was told no. He was given team orders to let Leclerc through, which he did. He then came into the pits, but then was told not to come into the pits, so cut across the line and didn't get a penalty. Then pit the lap after. Leclerc pit the lap after that, and then Sainz overtook Leclerc. I don't know if the anger is around if Sainz was supposed to overtake Leclerc or not at that point. I think, from my understanding, Leclerc thought there was no challenge from Sainz at that point. Sainz thought there was. That's where the anger's coming from. And then, of course, they get into the battle with Max, and Leclerc gets past Max eventually, but from there couldn't challenge Carlos. Should Leclerc have been on the podium, whatever that might be. But anyway, for Sainz himself, qualified 2nd, very good from him, and then finished the race in 3rd. I'm just going to give him a 10, because despite everything, and if Ferrari had actually listened to him, I think he would have been in a much better position, because those tyres were just gone. Sainz pulled out a very good performance to get on the podium from there. Going across to Charles Leclerc, though, qualified 4th, would end up finishing 4th, but a fantastic start from him, just jumped from 4th to 2nd. Then, realistically, was the only person who ever challenged George Russell in this race at that early point. Unfortunately for him, that cooked the tyres a bit too much for the Ferrari to handle, lost a few places from there, would pit and then came back again. Then the whole stuff with Sainz happens, but nonetheless, I think a very good race from Carlos Sainz, from Charles Leclerc. And I'm going to give him a 10 as well, just because of that fantastic start and the challenge to George. I think he was on the pace of Sainz, so he couldn't really separate him this weekend in the race at least. Let's move across to George Russell now, and a perfect weekend for him. Pole and the win. Did he lead every lap as well? He might have done. I'm going to double check my stats page now, just to make sure that is correct. But yeah, fantastic race from him. I've seen a lot, I said yesterday, and I've seen a lot of people say it as well, that, it doesn't matter where George and Lewis qualify, they always end up in the same place. And 9 times out of 10, I would agree with that. But I think this weekend it was a little bit different, and I think you've got to give George a bit more credit. Oh no, Lewis Hamilton led lap 13, so George led every lap apart from 1. So there we go. Still, can't take that away from him. We won't knock a point off for him there. But yeah, I think 9 times out of 10, I would agree with the whole thing of George can qualify on pole, Lewis can qualify last, and they always end up in the same place. This weekend, I would disagree with it a little bit, just because George was so in control of that race. At one point, he was like 10 seconds ahead, if not more, than everybody else. And he didn't need to push. Everyone was struggling on their tyres. Everyone was having a bad time. But George had such a gap that he could kind of just cruise to victory, manage the car, manage the tyres. Lewis needed to push because he had to get through traffic and then try and close down that gap. At the end, he couldn't because his tyres were gone. I think if he had caught the back of George's tyres would be in a much better position for him to defend from there, and he would have won anyway. So I disagree with the whole thing about George and Lewis this weekend. If it was a different time and like George qualified 8th and Lewis was 10th and they both finished 4th or whatever, maybe a bit of a different conversation. But this time I think George did everything perfectly well. So he gets a 10 out of 10. Across to Lewis Hamilton now. He qualified 10th, finished 2nd. Now, the race itself, fantastic from him. Really great stuff. Fantastic recovery drive to come through. Some great overtakes. Towards the end of the race, where he's just setting fastest lap after fastest lap after fastest lap. Really managed it well. As I said, didn't have the tyres at the very end of the race to challenge for the win, but nonetheless, very good. I'm only going to give him a 9, though, just because of qualifying. The Mercedes looked the best it's looked all weekend. Even if you go back to like Belgium or Silverstone, where they had those wins. I know they won in Austria as well, but they weren't really the fastest there. Like, if we look at Belgium, before we realised George was disqualified, where they were kind of the out-and-out quickest, I think they looked even better this weekend. And in qualifying, they seemed to be out-and-out the fastest car. And Lewis wasn't able to capitalise on that as good as he should have, because on the first lap I think he locked up, on the second lap he had a bit of oversteer, and he should have realistically been on the front row, and he wasn't. He was 10th, and because of that he had to do that recovery drive. It would have been great to see if they'd started next to each other how that would have gone, and I wouldn't have been surprised if Lewis would have won, but unfortunately that was compromised on the Saturday, so I can only give him a 9, but still a fantastic race from Lewis Hamilton. Oh look, Sergio Perez is here. He qualified 15th, and he managed to come back to 10th, so he did get a point. Oh, Fernando Alonso was 11th, wasn't he? He wasn't 10th. Nonetheless, good result. Whatever. Moving on. I stick by Fernando Alonso getting a 10 out of 10 because I think getting even 11th in that Aston Martin is very good. Sergio Perez was 10th. How could I forget that? It's a 4. I mean, he scored a point. But, you know, you had Max, who was fighting Ferraris and McLarens and winning the World Championship. So, I mean, a 4's rather generous. There you go. And across to Max Verstappen now, who I think had a fantastic weekend here. Qualified 5th, finished up in 5th, won the World Championship for the 4th time in a row. What else is there to say? I mean, this weekend, at the start of it, looked dreadful for him. All the way through practice 1, practice 2, the majority of practice 3, the Red Bull was just nowhere. They take a saw to the rear wing during FP3 to try and get some kind of speed out of the car. It gets them somewhere, and then he does that. He outqualified both of the McLarens. He outqualified one of the Mercedes. He did incredibly well. Then he had a very good start. Fought both McLarens. Well, he didn't fight them. He didn't even see them. They were miles behind. But, he was fighting with the Ferraris for a lot of it, who had much more pace than he should have done. I think out of that Red Bull, I don't think there's a driver on the planet who could have got more out of it than Max Verstappen did this weekend. For that reason, I'm giving him a 10. I don't even care. There you go. So, there it is, everyone. Our driver ratings for the Las Vegas Grand Prix. As I said, lots of 10s here. Verstappen, Russell, Leclerc, Sainz, Alonso, Tsunoda, Zhou, Hulkenberg all get 10s. Lowest score goes to Liam Lawson there with a 3. That's the driver ratings. Let me know what you think. We're back next weekend for the Qatar Sprint Race weekend. So the preview will be on Thursday, qualifying Friday, qualifying and the sprint on Saturday, race on Sunday, driver ratings on Monday. All that to come on the channel. I will see you then. Until next time, have a good one. Goodbye.